Without any prior knowledge or experience, I was able to rebuild this 300ZX, and we actually got it running in the last episode. But as you can hear, we actually have to find out why it's running like absolute dog water, which isn't the easiest task because I've done so much to this engine, it's gonna be really hard to trace down where I might have went wrong. But the best place to start is with the ECU to see if it can give us any clues of why this motor is running so bad. Since this car is a 1991, there's no OBD2 port, so to get the codes, we actually have to diagnose it straight from the computer, which you do by putting in diagnostic mode. I ended up getting code 12, which is directly related to the MAF sensor. Now the problem I faced is when I tried to clear the code, it wouldn't clear at all. It would immediately pop back up even without even trying to start the car, which led me to believe that the MAF was completely dead. But unfortunately, looking these up, they're almost $1,000 for an OEM one. And since I'm just throwing parts at it at this point, I went on Rock Auto and I got a Delphi one for 10% of the cost. Since it is a MAF car, it's probably prudent to put the actual air filter on. So I transferred the adapter plate from the old MAF to the new one. And this mounts directly up to the elbow with one hose clamp. And looking at the old filter, it's probably doing more harm than good. So I went ahead and replaced that with a new Jim Wolf Technology filter. And now we can just take some time to admire this beautiful filter before we start it up again. So we were able to eliminate the check engine light, and now we're getting code 55, which means that all systems are good. However, it's still idling pretty rough. And one thing I did notice is every time I shut off the car, there's a hissing noise coming from the brake booster, which leads me to believe the diaphragm is actually completely blown. This was one of those things that I considered changing, but I was like, how often do brake boosters go bad? And I didn't end up doing it. So now I'm gonna pay for it with some extra labor and a very tight engine bay. So I think this vacuum leak might get us to a better idle, but there's only one way to find out. I started off by removing the brake master cylinder to give me some room to pull out the brake booster. I'll save you guys the footage of my gooch of me being underneath the dashboard trying to get this detached from the brake pedal. But let me tell you, it was a miserable job, and it was just as miserable putting it back in. I'm a butthurt for OEM look, so I got this recreated ABS sticker, and I think it adds a nice little touch to the final product. And with that, we can start it back up and see how it idles. So it's idling a lot better now, but the idle is still very low. It's around 500 RPM. And whenever I hit the throttle, it stumbles really hard. So I know something still isn't right. And I was messing around over in the back of the engine trying to look for vacuum leaks or different issues. And I decided to mess with the idle air control. As I was unplugging it, I heard it kick on and the idle start to rise. Basically what the issue was, the idle air control valve was corroded, so I cleaned up the connector and it seems to be running a lot better. It does still have a little bit of a lifter tick, but I'm hoping with a little Italian tune-up when we get this thing back on the road, it'll sort all that out. But with the engine running really well now, we can dive into the rest of the car, like putting in the exhaust, addressing the suspension, and the rest of the drivetrain. Starting off, we're diving right into the differential. The pinion seal on this is leaking, and the guy who sold me this car actually came out to help me work on the car a little bit. His name's Eli.
And your boy Eli.
He also has a YouTube channel that he's starting. It's called I Can Fix It. Give him a follow, but he spent all day with me sweating in this garage, wrestling out this differential. And once we had it out, we had to be very careful with changing this pinion seal. I first marked the spot of the nut with the whiteout, and then I tested how much torque it actually took to spin the pinion. This is gonna make sure that we get it back in the exact spot when we put it back together so that we don't blow out our bearing. Then once the nut was removed, we used a puller to remove the housing. The seal popped right out and we can press in the new one. And then everything went back together the same. I made sure the torque was the same to spin the pinion gear, and then we rolled this thing up on the jack, and then Eli and I pushed it back into place. And to be honest, Eli and I got it back into place pretty easily. And once we got the mounts bolted up, it was time to address the drive shaft. I wanted to stick with the OEM feel, so I stuck with a 2-piece drive shaft over a 1-piece. It was a little bit more expensive, but my experience with the 1-piece drive shafts is they add a lot of vibrations. These things could be a pain to get in, but with the second set of hands, it was a breeze. Next up, to complete the Hikest Elite, we have this power trick bar that takes the place of the Hikest power steering rack in the rear. There's 2 bolts that go into the subframe, and then it ties into the tie rods, which means we'll probably need a 4-wheel alignment when everything's all said and done. Maxpeedingrod actually sent me some upper control arms and some coilovers for the Z, and I decided to test them out and see if they're worth anything. If not, we can always switch to a Power Tricks or a Teen coilover, since those aren't that expensive.
sick. Woo-wee. Oh, that's powdered? That's powdered right there. That's not a smooth texture. That's sick.
Get these in?
Absolutely.
Once the fun of unboxing was over, it was back to work. We soaked all the suspension bolts in some PB Blaster, and that combined with the air impact made easy work of this job. And once the upper control arms were out, it really put into perspective how bad they were compared to the new ones. And since the new ones are adjustable, we just adjust them to the same length as the OEM ones. We did the same exact thing with the coilovers, and before we put any new parts, we pressure washed and soaked down everything into greaser. That way it had a nice clean home to go into. And the last piece on the front was we had to get rid of these old crusty tension rods and replace them with these new SPC adjustable tension rods. And just to make sure all bases were covered, I went ahead and did some sway bar bushings in the front and the rear. Now to get the rear coilovers in, we had to do some disassembly on the interior, which meant removing this rear panel. And then with the bolts removed, they just slid right out. The only problem was with the Maxpeedingrod coilovers, the mount was a little bit wider than OEM, but I decided to run with it anyways and see how they do. I added some washers in between the bolt. And now it was time to tackle the brakes and these crusty calipers. I started off by sanding them down a little bit and making sure I gave them a good clean with a wire brush and some degreaser. And then I masked everything off with a trash bag and some tin foil. From there, I gave it a nice coat of paint with some high-temp paint. And here we have some drilled and slotted rotors with some ceramic brake pads. And this might have made the biggest difference on the suspension. They look so freaking good. I went with a gloss black and kept the Nissan logo silver. And looking at how disgusting the before is, it makes the after worth all the work that we put into it. And then moving on to the rear brakes, we had a little extra work. For some reason, a few of the lug studs were broken, so I hammered those out and replaced them with new ones. And then applied the same color scheme to the calipers in the back. Once those were painted, I put on some new drums and brake pads. And now we can move on to the exhaust. I have some 3-inch resonated test pipes from AMS, which will link up to a Megan Racing exhaust. For the mufflers, I went with the quad tips just to mimic the OEM look. And the fitment and alignment of everything on this was pretty good. It used all the stock mounting locations, so I was pretty happy with it. But we have a little bit more to do before we can hear the great sound of this exhaust. In the last stage, we got to fill this thing up with fluid. So I started off by filling up the clutch with some brake fluid, and I use this vacuum bleeder so that I could get it bled by myself. And the transmission actually comes with some shipping oil, so you have to drain it out and replace it with the proper fluid. And this Redline MT90 is pretty standard for 300ZX manual transmission, so that's what we're going with. And this is the glamorous process of pumping gear fluid into your transmission. Next, we moved on to the differential, which poured right all over my brand new exhaust. And unfortunately, while I was under the car, I discovered this small power steering leak. So I pulled as much as I could out of the reservoir. And when I disassembled it, I noticed this O-ring was completely flat, even though this was a rebuilt power steering pump. So I went ahead and changed those, and it was time to use one of my favorite tools in my garage. You use an adapter to attach this fitting to your cooling system, and then you're gonna attach some shop air to it, and it pulls a vacuum on your cooling system. And then you just drop the hose into your coolant, and not only does it test for leaks, it automatically fills your cooling system with no air. Since I took the heads to the machine shop, I did one more oil change, and I started this thing up, and it was running smooth. And that pretty much wraps up the entire drivetrain, meaning we can move on to the cosmetic stuff of the car. And as you can see, the interior is in pretty rough shape, but if you saw my Porsche series, you know that's my specialty. It was a previous track car and the interior was very tired, and we turned it into this beautiful masterpiece. So my plan is to do the same thing with the Z. I've already dropped off the seats at the upholstery shop, and I've got some stuff coming for the interior, which we're gonna go over all of that in the next episode. And then the last step will be to do the exterior. So I'm going to do a little bit of a body kit. We're going to respray the car, and I've got some really special wheels coming for this thing. So if you haven't already, make sure you drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys next week.